we'll be looking at Strava data today. So me and my colleagues are working on a whole bunch of projects connected to this data set. So today I wanted to say a little bit about what the data set is, and talk a little bit about what might we be able to do with it, and maybe what is it not so suitable for. So I'm presenting it, and my colleague Jin, Mark, and an intern who work with us, Kirsty, are also part of this project. I'm afraid you're listening to me twice today because my colleague Jin couldn't make it, so just to warn you of that already. So we're interested as one of our research areas in active travel. So the Transport Scotland has some ambitious targets about getting more journeys to be made by walking and cycling. In particular, 10% of journeys should be made by bicycle by 2020. Cities have been given the responsibility for achieving this. So we want to know, how can we do this? What interventions might be required? What interventions might work and might not work? Why is this target? Well, all sorts of good things come from more active travel. We have reduced congestion, reduced emissions, improved public health, and so on. And potentially time savings. Maybe we can get places quicker if we walk or cycle. That might be a more efficient way to move around. So lots of benefits, but well, how can we achieve this? How can we get these ambitious targets? One of the issues is trying to evaluate interventions that occur. So interventions might be something like building physical infrastructure. So if you go around Glasgow, you'll see lots of cycle lanes, some segregated, some painted on the road. Maybe behavioural interventions in schools, for instance, trying to encourage people to cycle. But how do we know if they've achieved what we wanted them to achieve? Particularly important, some of the cycling infrastructure in particular is very expensive, so if we're investing millions of pounds in it, was it worth the money? So usually this is quite difficult to do because we need some data. So what data do we traditionally have? Well, we have manual counts which take place. So in Glasgow, a couple of days every year, they rig up some cameras, they film the road for a day, and someone goes through it and counts how many cyclists appear on it. So that's one way we might do it. We might just count the people. It's expensive, tends not to be done so often because it requires someone to sit there and do it. So maybe not ideal, and it doesn't give us a good coverage of the city. It tends to be on particular links and at particular times. We can use automatic counters, of course, and if you go around Glasgow, you'll see some of these being installed as well. Again, though, these are quite expensive. They require quite particular maintenance to make sure they're accurate and to keep them calibrated. So sometimes people have a good idea and they install it, but it's not maintained, so it doesn't give accurate data. So expensive, require maintenance, require long-term planning to keep them operational, and this tends to result in them being sparsely located. So these are a couple of the main things we would have. We could also say survey data here, so surveying people. As cycling mode share is quite low though, surveys tend not to pick up too many cyclists, and they tend not to give fine-grained information about are they on this particular road at a particular time. So there are some new forms of data starting to appear now and emerge which we might be able to use. And one of the categories we could call it are the activity tracking apps. So there's a whole bunch of apps which you can now install on your phone or smartwatch or whatever device you have to track what you're doing and what your activity is. One such app is called the Strava app. Does anyone use the Strava app? Oh, good. You probably know more about it than me. I don't use the app. I just analyze the data that comes from it. So I probably, if I say something wrong about the app, you can correct me. So it offers the possibility of us having data at a very fine spatial scale and a very fine temporal scale. So we can really get a lot of information about where are cyclists cycling and when are they cycling there. Other benefit is the data has already been collected and it's collected globally. So pretty much every country, I think, has at least some Strava cyclers going around. So this is a sort of method and data that can be applied everywhere. And it also facilitates comparisons because you have the same sort of data collected in potentially the same sort of way. So if you don't know it, Strava is from the Swedish word Strava, meaning to strive. It can be used to track running and cycling. We're mostly focusing on people tracking their cycling journeys with it. It offers all kinds of features, so you can track your activities over time, you can compare what you're doing to what your friends are doing. There's also competitions, I understand, to see who has the fastest time up some hill in Glasgow and so on. So some of you will know this if you're competitive. So it has this sort of gamification element in there. The app comes in a free and premium version, so as you expect, the premium version offers some extra functionality, but anyone can install it and start using it and start generating data. And it goes on a variety of devices, and it looks something like this. Users have to start and stop the tracking, so it doesn't run passively in the background. It requires some interaction from the user to be tracking. It is also an ability to attach some data to it, so you can tag whether a particular trip is a commute, for instance, and Strava gathers some demographic information about who's using their app. So the data the app gets is GPS data. This isn't actual Strava GPS data. That isn't given to researchers, but it would collect something that looks like this GPS data, where you have some points collected as the person moves around. So researchers don't have to process this GPS data. For better or worse, it's done by Strava for us, and then they give out some products which have made certain aggregations and anonymizations. So the data gets aggregated, and this is what's available to researchers, and it's what's offered by the Urban Big Data Centre if you're interested in working with this data. So we get a number of products out of this, or data sets. So we have the origin and destination of different cycling trips. That's given at output area level, which is the smallest census geography. So we know which output area the journey starts in, and exactly when it starts, and we know which output area the journey ends in, and we know which output areas that the person has travelled through as they make their way from the origin to the destination. So it gives us good information about where people are coming from, going to, and something about the routes that they take. We also have minute-by-minute link counts of cycling flows, so for every minute we know how many Strava cyclists pass down a particular link in the road network. The other product we have is information at the level of junctions, so we know, for instance, how long people have to wait at different junctions in the road network, what are the waiting times there, and what are the volume of cyclists passing through those junctions. Some of you might wonder, they collect demographic information, but they don't attach this to the individual trips or the individual observations. So we know something about the demographic composition of the sample as a whole, but we don't have this attached to individual journey information. Strava has said that there is some possibility of getting the data broken down, for instance, by gender. So it may be possible for them to do some aggregation, since they have the data, they can do it, but they don't release it as standard. So just a little picture to break up the text. So this is a map of desire lines showing the origins and destinations from the Strava data. So you can see, not surprisingly, Glasgow and Edinburgh lit up, Stirling, and you can see some of the trips between them. There's trips elsewhere, but the lines are set to be a bit transparent, so you'll see there are some lines dotted about. If you have excellent eyesight, you might see. We have a heat map, so you might recognise the city centre of Glasgow here, and you might recognise the river, the cycle route along the north side of the Clyde, very popular route, Great Western Road, Kelvin Grove Park, and so on. So you get some idea of which locations are popular with cyclists. And then the data set of junctions, showing here the size of the points proportional to how long people wait at the junction. So you can see there's a fair amount of waiting in the junctions on this road, and fewer, lower waiting times than some of the other ones. So that's good. This is more data than we've ever had for cycling before. Cycling's been the area where we really haven't known very much. Problems though. Well, we know that not every cyclist is going to use the app. Even the app users may not be tracking every journey, particularly routine journeys. Maybe they're less likely to track it, or if they're doing something that's boring, maybe they don't want to track it. So a bit of a problem there. We also know it's not likely to be a random sample of cyclists that are going to be using the app. We might speculate that they're more competitive cyclists, they're more professional cyclists, there might at least be something different about them that we're not sure about. So in Glasgow, for instance, in 2015 in the data set, there were 13,684 athletes, as they're called in the Strava speak, and they recorded 287,000 activities. So I mean, it's far higher number of cyclists than you would expect to get data from anywhere else, but we might worry that, is this really representative? And we can see here, men are overrepresented, 11,000 men compared to 1,700 women. We probably expect men to cycle a bit more than women in the population. The sample seems to be dominated by men though, so this might worry us. So the question we've started trying to answer, and it's ongoing work, is can the sample tell us something useful, or is the behavior of this group totally atypical, so that even though we have lots of people and lots of data, maybe it's just telling us biased things. Maybe we can't generalize so much from it. So the first thing we might think about doing, and in fact we've done it here, is to visualize the data to see does it at least make sense. I think if you know Glasgow and you look at the heat map, probably it makes sense. If you walk along the river, you'll see it's heavily trafficked by cyclists. If you go along some of the other roads, you see that they tie up with where cycling infrastructure is and so on. So it doesn't look ridiculous for a start. It's not that the cyclists really love exercise, so they're taking all the steepest hills or so on. There does seem to be some of the behavior you would expect, that people tend to try and avoid hills, they try and avoid junctions, they try and go closer to green space, all the things that we know from the literature about how cyclists behave. One thing we wanted to try and do that was maybe a little bit more systematic was compare it to some of these more established sources of data. So we used this 2-day annual cordon count that they do in Glasgow. If you've looked at the map of Glasgow, you'll see it's sort of enveloped by the motorway to create a sort of demarcated city centre area, which makes it quite convenient to put counts at all the roads in and out of this area to count who's coming into the city centre and who's going out of the city centre. So it comes close to counting everyone who's moving about on these particular days. So what we wanted to do is to match the links where these manual counts take place to the corresponding links in the Strava data. That sounds very simple. It actually turned out to be a lot of messing about with the data and trying to get it all to line up and match up. I think we're almost there. There's a couple of bugs still to iron out. So we have this city centre of Glasgow, and then we have the count locations marked around here, and then for 3 years, I think we've just gotten the 4th year, we have both the Strava data and the manual count data. So for the manual count, we get blocks of 30 minutes over 14 hours for 2 days in September every year when they do these counts. We're using data from 2013, 14, and 15. We'll probably add 16 because I think we just got that recently. So we aggregate the data up into matching timeframes so that we can do some comparisons. So we have a few different ways that we aggregate the data temporarily because we are interested in how fine-grained can we go in the data before it starts breaking down and not telling us anything. So we use as our lowest aggregation hourly flows, so we want to see how well the Strava flows correspond to the hourly flows. We had a hypothesis that commuting time might have something to do with it, so we create 2 time periods, commuting time and non-commuting time. So the AM and PM peak were put into peak hours versus non-peak. So we had this idea that commuters are maybe more or less likely to use the app. We aggregated it up to day, so can we predict how many flows there are in a day, and then 2 days, which was the extent of the annual data. So we had a look at some of the correlations. So if we look at the hourly correlations, we get something that's pretty high, 0.78. So we seem to get a good correlation with the spatial variation in the number of cyclists, even going down to the hourly level. Unsurprisingly, as we aggregate up from the hourly level, the correlation improves slightly. So if we split it into this peak versus non-peak, within the day we get up to 0.86, and then for the daily rates we get up to 0.882. Aggregating up to 2 days doesn't seem to make much difference. So it seems quite reasonable that we can say something about the spatial distribution of cyclists based on the Strava data. It seems to correspond with the counts that take in all the cyclists. So this gives us a little bit more, or makes us a bit more comfortable about using it. Future work we want to do, or we have some additional hypotheses which we want to test. So, are there certain areas where the Strava, the correlation between Strava cyclists and all cyclists are higher? So the west end of Glasgow, as you may know, is a more affluent area compared to the east end. So we wondered, is it perhaps more popular to use Strava in the west end than it is in the east end? So might the correlations be different? And if we were thinking about adjusting the Strava data up towards or inflating it, might we need to change that depending on where we're located? Does the market share of Strava change over time? So if the app's becoming more popular, we might need to think about changing how we inflate the data. Might the weather have an effect on who's using Strava? So we had this idea that perhaps the Strava cyclists would be out come rain or shine and they would be cycling, but maybe the other people would say, I'm not going out in that today, I'll take the subway. And does the time of day affect the share of people who are using the Strava app? So this is still a bit ongoing because we've had some issues getting our data the way we wanted it, but we've been working with some negative binomial regression models trying to say what is the relationship between the observed number of cyclists and the number of cyclists who've used the Strava app. So there's too many numbers on this table. I didn't want to talk too much about it because it's still a bit ongoing, but this is the direction we're taking the research in now. So at the top there we have the number of Strava cyclists as one of our independent variables. It thankfully appears positively signed and significant in all of the models, and then we include various different control variables to try and say something about are there some different effects. So we have a north, south, west set of dummy variables here. So you can see sometimes the west seems to be associated with having a higher number of cyclists. And we include some other interaction variables to try and pick apart a bit more what's the relationship and how does it change. I don't want to say too much about this though, because this is based on a preliminary version of the data set, so it may still have some errors in it. So far the work seems to say that we have a good correlation between what the Strava cyclists do and what the regular cyclists or the cyclists we observe do. The correlation improves as we aggregate the observations. So on links where there are quite a high number of flows, it seems to be better at predicting that. The correlations do change depending on these different factors. So even though our analysis is still quite preliminary, it does seem that the direction or the socioeconomic status of the area may have some impact on the balance or on the market share of the Strava app. And that seems to marry up broadly with what's in the literature, thankfully. So this is some of our work trying to see, do we trust the data? Some of the other projects we're now using this for are to look at the effect of installing cycling infrastructure. So our models seem to indicate that has a positive effect. We're looking at the impact of the closure of the subway in Glasgow. They closed it for maintenance for 1 month last year, and it seems you can detect effects on what's happening in Strava data based on that kind of intervention. So it seems like a good data set to use from what we figured out so far. We hope to come up with a set of suggestions or models that can be used to adjust the data from what we observe in Strava to what we would expect to observe if we did a manual count. So that's the quick Cook's tour of Strava data for you.
Thanks to David to introduce. So now we have some overview of the Strava data. So now I can save some time. I don't need to introduce the detail of the Strava data anymore. So I just go directly to some applications. So this is my topic. It's about how to use the Strava data link cycling behavior to air pollution exposure. So first, so we know that cycling will produce some benefits and also risks. So as David introduced before, so there are some benefits like reduce carbon emissions, reduce traffic congestions, and also exercise to the cyclists to enhance their physical activity and to increase fitness of muscles and also some other organs in your body. So here we also need to focus on some risks brought by cycling. So first of all, that if there's some traffic accidents, cyclists are more likely to be injured or go to die than the people in the motor vehicles. So this is easy to understand because they don't have protections like cars, and so they are easily to be died. And particularly in some regions, they are very dangerous for cyclists, like some streets which has a very high slope, or some streets they are not very narrow and don't have separate bike lanes. Also, they are particularly in some extremely weather conditions. For example, the road is very wet, and also the street has a very high slope. So they are also very likely to see some traffic accidents. So in this case, cyclists are easy to be injured. So apart from the road safety, so air pollution exposure is also an important issue for cyclists. Not only for cyclists, but also for any outdoor activities, because you are directly exposed to the air pollution, particularly in some very polluted areas. So, for example, there are some developing and fast-growing countries like China and India. In some megacities, there are very serious air pollution issues there. So people are very likely to exposed to very poor air. So they are very likely to get some healthy issues. So now we use Strava data. We have a chance to make an accurate assessment of air pollution for cyclists. So due to the advantages of Strava Metro data, like it's a high and spatial granularity, it's larger coverage, not only major streets but also minor streets. Also, it also indicates the cycling purpose. So it's cyclists are riding for commuting purpose or riding for recreational purpose. So in this application, I try to investigate cyclists' exposure to air pollution by cycling purpose using Strava Metro data. So here I first go through how the Strava Metro to identify or to determine the cycling purpose of each cycling trips. So first of all, in the cycling the app or for the specific account, so the cyclist can use commute flag to indicate the purpose of their cycling trips. For example, if I come here today, so I might use commute flag because this is related to my work or related to business. Or for example, if I cycle, I ride on weekend together with some friends. So that is only for fun. So some users may not use commute flag because this is recreational cycling. So this first kind is that the purpose is acquired by the self-reported approach. So which means that the cyclists, they self-report the cycling purpose in their account. But unfortunately, most of the cyclists don't usually do this. So they don't care so the cycling purpose. They don't want to tell other process or they never be aware of it. So the Strava Metro, when they are producing the data set, they try to use other ways to identify more commuting trips. So they use some other methods trying to identify commuting trips based on some information offered by the cyclists. For example, they first try to look at the text made by the users. So like some other social media, so users all can create some text to describe their trips or their activities. So if there are some text like commute, so this trip is also considered commuting trips. Also, apart from the text directly, so there are also some other information related to commuting in the titles of the trips, like commute to somewhere or to work, things like that. So this kind of trips are also identified as commuting trips. So apart from the information which is available from the text information, so distance, time, or speed are also used by the Strava Metro, the data producer, to identify commuting trips. So they use some specific methods or specific methods to identify the other commuting trips. So if they find or they identified all of the commuting trips from the Strava trips, so the rest of the trips are considered recreational trips. So this is the way. Despite some bias or risks here, but still give us opportunity to analyze the patterns of cycling behavior by cycling purpose. So as a consequence, we couldn't know that. So so in each junctions, so how many all-purpose cycling activities in each junctions. This means that also, so in 1 year, how many cycling trips pass these junctions. So apart from the number of the all-purpose cycling activities, so we also know the number of commuting activities and also the number of recreational activities in each node. So we will get a simple map about to how the commuting activities and the recreational activities distribute over the city in terms of the street network. So this is Glasgow, and this is zoom in map here. So this is junctions or street intersections. So we all know these three attributes in each junctions. So so usually traditionally the researchers pay more attention to the commuting and cycling behavior, because this is very related to travel model and commuting to work and things like related to transport and jobs. So less attention paid to recreational cycling activities due to the lack of data. So now in this application, we pay more attention to the recreational cycling behavior. So as the total number of commuting activities is much larger than the total number of recreational activity. So we use this term. We use an indicator here to we give more attention to the recreational cycling's dominance in each area. So first, to reduce the random effects, so we first aggregate the cycling activities from the junctions to the census areas. So first we intersect the Strava nodes and the census areas. Then we sum the cycling activities in each census areas. So here we need to pay attention to that. So here, there's over counting users here because some activities or points they are mined from the same cycling trips, but because we don't know the original individual information about the trips, so we can only use this way to simplify the aggregation. And so after we aggregate the cycling activities from the nodes to the census, then we use an indicator. We call it like air recreational rate in each area. So this is which equals to the number of the recreational cycling activities in each area, divided by the total number of all-purpose cycling activities in each area. So this indicator is to measure the dominance of recreational activities in each area. So the higher the indicator, the more dominant recreational cycling is here. So the next step, we use some clustering method to find out where recreational cycling is much more dominant than the commuting cycling. So we want to find the areas in Glasgow. So this is the clustering method I used. So I don't want to go detail about this method. So this is a clustering method which try to identify clusters composed of adjacent polygons. And so the observation is the recreational rate, and the area unit is census output area. So this is the result of clustering. So first, the red color means the cluster of high value. So here the high value means that high level recreational rate, which means that there are more recreational activities in that area. So we find that, okay, so the clusters of high rate is likely to locate it in the peripheral areas of the city. So it looks like so recreational cyclists are more likely to ride in the peripheral areas than the central areas. So this is, correspond with to our common knowledge, because we think that if cyclists they are riding for fun, they would like to choose some areas like the peripheral areas, which is not very crowded, which is more adventurous, and which you can also get a good view of the things, or you are very close to green space, or to some mountains, or to some rivers. So, so recreational cyclists are very likely to go to these areas. And for the commuting cyclists, because they usually want to choose the fastest way to their workplace or to their home, so they usually go through the central areas because the road infrastructure and there, so they usually go to there. Inspired by the clusters of the recreational cyclists, so if we combine this map with the air pollution map like the PM 2.5, we will find some interesting things that. So here, so in the air pollution data, usually in the central city centers, the air pollution is higher, means that poor air condition, air quality there. So we will find that in the areas, okay, the peripheral areas where the recreational cyclists are likely to go is also the areas has the least polluted, which are also the least polluted areas. So inspired by these two maps, so I do a further analysis. So I want to calculate so how many the proportions of recreational activities and also the community activities are located in the unsafe areas. So here the unsafe areas are the areas where the air pollution exceeds the safety limits. So here the safety limits are used a standard from the WHO safety limits. So if the air pollution level is higher than this limit, we call this area is the unsafe area in the context of air pollution. So then we calculate the proportion of the activities in the unsafe areas for recreational and commuting purpose. This is some equations how I calculate it. So this is the percentages of activities in the unsafe areas for recreational and commuting purpose. So we will see that much more percent of recreational activities are located in unsafe areas than the percent of the recreational activities located in the unsafe areas. So, which means that commuting cyclists are more likely to ride through the unsafe areas than the recreational activities cyclists. So we know that commuting cyclists are more likely to be exposed to unsafe levels of air pollution than the recreational cyclists in Glasgow. So which means that if you like cycling, you should cycle more for recreational purpose to avoid and reduce your exposure to the air pollution. But you should take care of the road safety in these areas because there are a lot of hills and mountains there. So in some areas the lanes are very narrow and not wide. So there are some limitations. So in this application, first of all, this is only a start of using Strava data to link cycling behavior to air pollution exposure. So first, I use the air pollution data, which is 1 kilometer grids. Actually, it's relatively has a relatively low spatial resolution. Now there are higher resolution data like 100 meter or even 10 meter grids are produced by some organizations or some research groups. In the future, we will try to get some data like that. The second is that we only use the annual mean air pollution data, but actually air pollution also vary over not only space but also vary over time. So it means that in summer or in winter, the air pollution in the same regions might be different. So in the data we only use the data we used lack the don't have the temporal, high temporal resolution. So in the future, we want to get the data, or we want to take account of the monthly or weekly variation of the air pollution. So the second is that, so apart from the air pollution exposure, so road safety is another very important issue in estimate of risks of cycling. So we will try to estimate that the road safety for cycling at the street level, because we have the street level cycling data, and also some other data about the cycling infrastructure and slope, which we can get from DEM or DTM data, and also wear condition in real time. So overall, we will get a comprehensive understanding of the cycling risk in Glasgow. Thanks.
I'm not sure that my title's so relevant to keep changing the title. So this is some work that I'm doing with my colleague Yeran Sun, who was also with me on the first paper. What we're really interested in is, does changes in how people use ICT have some impact on their travel behavior? So this is especially my colleague's broad area of interest, and we have a specific set of questions for this paper. So the thing that's motivated our discussion here is that there's been observed around the world that young people, the millennial generation, which we can say roughly between 1980 and 2000, they seem to be traveling differently from previous generations. And in particular, they seem to be using cars less than they previously have. There seems to be less traveling overall and less use of cars. We see this both in terms of how much this generation travels by car, but also in things like licensing rates. They tend to get driving licenses less and later in life if they do get them. So this is important when we think about things like long-term planning. What do we expect to happen to car ownership rates and traveling? How should we plan our transport infrastructure in the long term? This requires huge sums of money to be committed, and if we are wrong about how people are going to use cars, then maybe well, it would be valuable to know if we're going to be wrong. So there's been various discussions in the literature. This is obviously a problem or a phenomenon which is going to have all kinds of different aspects to it. So some people have pointed to economic constraints, suggesting that it's more expensive to learn how to drive now in particular. Insurance for cars is expensive for young people. So, and we've had the recession and so on. So there's been some discussion that, well, maybe that explains it. They don't have the money, and when they get the money later on, then that will solve the problem. There's been some evidence of that, but there's also been some evidence that said in some of the countries this fall started even when the real cost of motoring was falling and even when the economy was doing well. So it doesn't seem to get the entire picture. There's been discussion of attitudinal differences, so millennials seem to be more likely to have favourable attitudes towards public transport and active travel, and tend to be more concerned about the environment. So it's been suggested that this may have some impact on their behaviour. Partly related to this, they tend to locate slightly differently, so millennials seem more likely to want to live in city centre locations or in dense locations, and in those locations there tends to be better public transport provision and things tend to be closer. So having a car may be less important, and perhaps there's not even parking for a car. Life cycle factors have also been suggested. So people tend to get married later, they tend to have children later, they tend to spend longer in education than in previous generations. So it could just be that once they get to the age when they're having children and they have to drop the children off and go to work and have a complex travel pattern, maybe then they will get a car. So maybe we'll see this thing disappear and we'll see car use rise. Another thing that's been suggested is that information and communication technology, particularly mobile devices, may have some impact on how people choose to travel. Partly this may be motivated by the fact that we can get much better information about public transport. So if some of you are visiting Glasgow, it's probably easier now for you to go onto Google and say, I want to go from A to B, and you'll get information about how the public transport works. I'm afraid in Glasgow you might not be very happy with the result, but it will at least tell you how you might get between different places. But it also may change the way that we use the modes. So just some graphs, actually too many graphs, but some graphs to show that in different countries around the world, we see number of trips starting to fall, and we see stagnation in the total distance being traveled. So you can see for travel in London, the mode share of car at the top there with triangles falling over time. See Birmingham, car falling. Manchester, the modal share of car falling. So fewer cars being used, at least in the cities. And nationally, we also see some stagnation. The data here is a little bit old, I couldn't find the newer stuff. But we see some drop off in how far people are traveling, how much they're traveling, and so on. So there's a big literature trying to say, why is this? So ICT has changed many aspects of our lives, sometimes maybe for the better, sometimes maybe for the worse. But one thing that this might mean is that the value of travel time has changed. So typically, transport improvements would be justified by they save you time. So if any of you followed the HS2 debate and the calculations, one of the big things was the faster train will save people time, and this is of value to society. The counter argument was, well, if people are sitting on the train working, they'll just do more work in the office at the other end. You're not saving anyone any time, they're just doing the work in a different place. So perhaps what we really mean, or what we think about by travel time, has changed, and I think ICT's certainly had some influence there. It's given us more options to do things on the go, whether we like to or not. So, in particular, this might affect modes where we could use a mobile device. So in a car, you can use your mobile to do some things. You could have some text messages or emails read out perhaps, but you're a bit limited. You can't sit behind the wheel and write a paper, or shouldn't at least. So perhaps this might make us keener to say, well, I'll take the train or I'll take a bus, because then I can sit on my smartphone and check my email or write some emails or engage in some leisure activity. So perhaps it would slightly switch the preference over towards public transport. There's been some literature on this. The first attempts at discussing this tended to be around Wi-Fi, particularly looking on trains. Some studies also looking at bus travel and finding that if you provide internet access, it tends to improve ridership on public transport, and people seem to like it. That's become a bit less important. Now we have reasonable 4G coverage, though not on some train lines, but we have more access to the internet whether we have Wi-Fi provided or not, and hopefully that will continue to improve. So what about smartphones? What might that do to people's travel behaviour? We thought we'd have a picture that we probably all recognise. Anytime you go on public transport now, a large percentage of people will be looking at a phone or some screen of some description. Some people argue this isn't actually a change. If you've gone on public transport 50 years ago, everyone would have the morning newspaper. Does it really matter how they consume the media? Maybe, maybe not. So one of the reasons this is a difficult thing to investigate is that the data is a bit tough to get. It's a very complicated business. There's all sorts of stuff going on, and how might we start to disentangle this? How might we pick apart some of the causes? All kinds of factors influence travel behaviour. So what do we do about that? So we thankfully had a data set which we thought might be quite useful for this. Miriam has mentioned at the start the integrated multimedia city data. So that provides a whole bunch of variables and all sorts of stuff that we can use to try and pick apart this question a little bit. So just to say a bit about the survey, again, this is something you can apply to use from the centre. It was a large-scale survey which took place in the, I cut out a word, the Glasgow and Clyde Valley planning area from April to November in 2015. There was a household survey, which is the part we're mostly working with here. So we had 2,095 people being interviewed from around 1,500 households. The survey unusually covers quite a lot of different areas, so there's questions that we would expect, sociodemographic questions, but there's also questions about literacy, different types of literacy, sustainability, ICT use, civic, cultural activities. People also completed the travel diary as part of this. Although we don't use it, there's also GPS data collected and other data such as Twitter data, so what was going on Twitter at the time the survey was collected. That type of data would be quite useful to measure something about the context in which the survey took place and other factors which may have affected it. So we may well incorporate some of these other types of data later on. So what's important for us? Well, one of the things we wanted to look at was car ownership. That was the main question in this paper. So millennials who didn't have a car were asked the question whether they plan to get their own car within the next 5 years. So that was an important question for us to look at. What influenced this plan? Were certain people more or less likely to say that they were going to get a car? The other thing people were asked, how often do you access the internet whilst traveling? And they could respond never, rarely, sometimes, or often. We know some other important things: age, sex, working status, income, the composition of their household in terms of number of adults and children, and so on. And importantly, we also know something about their attitudes, so we know something about their preferences towards driving and public transport. So we are able to control for quite a lot of variables in the model that aren't usually available. So in terms of attitudes, the variables we use are people being asked how much they agree with the statements. For me, to drive a car for regular daily journeys is something I like, and then the same question, but for public transport. So we get some idea, do they like driving, do they like public transport? Presumably that will affect their intention about what we're going to do. To start out, and because this is a sort of question that's looked at in the literature, although it's not directly what we're looking at, was to say, well, how many trips do people make by private transport, by their car, and how many trips do they make by public transport? And how do these variables influence those trip generation rates? So our hypothesis is that people who are using the internet more frequently will tend to make more trips by public transport. So our dependent variable for our models are the number of trips by public transport and the number of trips made by private transport, or by driving. So we use negative binomial regression model. It's the second one I presented today. I know other models. It fitted the distribution of the data. So the key bits at the bottom here, where we have our do use the internet while traveling, with the reference group being never. So we see something in the direction we expect. So for public transport, there seems to be an increase, a statistically significant increase in the number of trips made for people who are always using the internet. There also seems to be an indication that people who like to use the internet while traveling also like driving more. So it seemed, well, they like to travel more seems to be the picture that emerges from this. They seem to be more mobile people. The coefficient is larger for public transport than it is for the driving group. So they do seem to like public transport, but they also seem to be quite happy to drive as well. So this may tell us something about how mobile they are, or it may correlate with some other factor in their lives which we don't manage to control for. We do manage to control for age, sex, working, life cycle, so we create some variables to describe whether they have children in the household or so on, because that might dictate how flexible they have to be in their travel arrangements. And we control for their attitudes. So I think we can see that people who like driving tend to drive, and people who like public transport like take public transport. So that's good news to have. So the internet users seem more likely to travel, although it doesn't matter particularly what mode, but the effect seems to be stronger for public transport. So the internet users seems to generate more trips for the public transport users. We've discussed and done some experimenting around reverse causality, because it probably makes as much or maybe more sense to say, well, the people who use public transport the most are sitting there bored, so they take out their phone and they use the internet a lot. So that could also be part of the explanation. We did some work with an instrumental variable model where we used as an instrument how comfortable the person felt fixing problems on a computer and how comfortable they felt creating content on social media platforms. So we had the idea that the people who were more technically able might influence whether they use the internet when traveling, but that may not be causally linked with their travel behavior. So that seemed to suggest the results were robust, but we still are thinking of these more as correlations than trying to claim that they're causal effects. We wanted to try the same model on the Millennials to see is there something different. So we used all the people in the first model I presented, and then we wanted to use just the Millennial sample. Unfortunately, that dropped us down to 375 Millennials, so it reduced their sample size quite a lot. So when we run the model again, don't get as much coming out as significant. You still see something of the same pattern that the heavy internet users tend to be traveling more, but the effects are not statistically significant anymore. But given the sample size and the number of variables in the model, we're not so surprised about that. So the main thing we were talking about before we got distracted with our trip generation was to look at, well, what about buying this car? Who's buying the car and who's not buying the car in the next 5 years? Our hypothesis was that the internet users might be less keen on getting a car because they are not able to benefit from using the technology in the same way as they have a car. So people could respond, yes, they were going to get a car in the next 5 years, or no, or they don't know. We modeled all three of these outcomes, so we used multinomial logistic regression model to allow them to respond to anything in the model, and we took yes here as the reference category. So at the bottom again, we have this internet use whilst traveling. Only for the don't know category was it statistically significant at 5% level, so the heavier internet users were less likely to respond don't know. Therefore, they were more likely to say yes, they did plan to get a car in the next 5 years. So it seems that our hypothesis that the internet's going to be part of the explanation of why there are people not driving and not wanting to get a car didn't seem to hold up. They seem to be a more mobile group, and we seem that, yes, they want to get a car in the future. It's more likely that they will say that. So we can't rely on that to save the problem with too many cars on the road. This ties in with the story in the literature that says that this is more lifestyle factors, economic factors, and the behavior of the millennials will start to converge with previous generations, but it may just take a bit longer. Probably just said everything that's on the slide. Yeah, so it is correlations. There's a lot going on. We try to control for important variables, and the data set allows us to control for stuff that isn't usually available, so we think it's probably the best that can be done at the moment, at least with the data we have. But people seem to like driving, even the millennials. So, thank you.
So I guess a principle of statistics is to avoid or to control at least for bias. Now you may jump to the conclusion that's a comment about the data and the application of the data and kind of the validity of the data. It's not actually. It's a comment about me. I'm a geographer by background and by day job, so I do tend to look at everything through a geographical lens, and that's going to become very clear as I go on over the next few minutes. I also edit a journal, Environmental Planning B, and it has a subtitle now, Urban Analytics and City Science. Urban Analytics and City Science, which would include the data science of urban movement, which was the title of this particular session. Which raises the question, so what is urban analytics and city science about? What is data science and urban movement about? What would characterise it in some way? And again, see the geographer's going to come through here. It's about geographical data. It's about measuring geographical processes. So using those geographical data to measure geographical processes. But why? Why do it? So you have some sense as well that those geographical processes are occurring within some geographical context. Indeed, those geographical processes both shape and are shaped by those geographical contexts in which they're occurring. Now, if those kind of in some way identify what kind of, in broad sense, what this session might be about, actually there's another conference going on right now in Leeds, which is interested in very similar questions, the Geocomputation Conference. And it's on its 21st anniversary this year. It started in Leeds and it's gone back to Leeds. This may seem like a tangent, hopefully not too much. But in this journal I mentioned, we recently published a reflection. It's sort of, what is geocomputation? What is it about? And when it came about, it was defined by what it wasn't, what it isn't. So it wasn't GIS, Geographical Information Systems, mapping systems. That didn't define geocomputation. It wasn't about quantitative geography. And it wasn't about kind of traditional statistics applied to traditional survey data. Paul Longley, who was actually my PhD advisor at the time, defined it as this: as the creative and experimental application of geographical information technologies and research that emphasises process over form, dynamics over statics, and interaction over passive response. Now, what my colleagues at the Urban Big Data Centre have been doing, they may not self-identify as geocomputationists, but certainly it could fall under the umbrella of geocomputation. If I underline some of those words in definition of geocomputation: creative, experimental, geographical information process, dynamics. I think I can give you all, I can give you a bit of a thumbs up there. I think you are doing that. So yeah, the thumbs up there. But there's always a but. And so here is the but. Let's return to the parentheses. So this was about defining what these things might be about. It's about geographical processes occurring within and both shape and are shaped by a geographical context. So again, the both shape and are shaped by are in parentheses, are in brackets, but they're the key. That's the important bit. That bit I put into a bracket is actually central to everything. So Alison Hempenstall, a colleague at Leeds University, raises the question: how can we use new forms of data to understand how real people shape and are shaped by geographical processes? For a social scientist like myself, that's the key question. In terms of urban geography, in terms of urban sociology, in terms of urban policy, that's the key question. It's about the interaction of people and places and how they produce and co-constitute each other. So this raises some pretty non-trivial questions. Now, how does all this computational power and all these data get us beyond measuring just spatially differentiated outcomes, shading different parts of the map differently, to somehow understanding better the processes that created those outcomes in the first place? How do we validate what we think we know about those processes, and on what basis do we develop or discount existing theories? How does geocomputation or urban analytics or data science, you can call it whatever you like, how does it engage with and contribute to the best of quantitative social science? Or I could put it another way: how do urban data inform us, not just about urban outcomes, but actually about urban morphology and change? How cities evolve. This is a science, a city science. How cities evolve and change. How it can tell us about the interaction between people and places, between urban forms and functions, about how cities evolve or work as broadly chaotic systems, about how people behave and make decisions in different spatial places and contexts, and under varying socioeconomic and other constraints. And given all those kind of rather non-trivial questions, what would the urban analytics of a city science or a data science of urban movement, what would it look like to address those kind of questions? Well, I guess, just in passing, here are some thoughts and ideas of what it might look like. It's going to involve algorithms, and it's going to involve heuristics, but also some means to validate them. So we're going to be doing things to data in creative and experimental ways, but in some way it needs to be validated. It'll be geographical, but it'll also be temporal, and sensitive to geographical context. What happens in different places is not the same. We get variances around averages to geography. You're interested in the spatial variance around an average. Different things happen in different places. And it's going to be exploratory. But at some point, surely it's got to be rooted in social and economic theory. So many, 21 years ago when they started the Geocomputation Conference, people were interested in abductive reasoning as opposed to deductive or inductive reasoning, abductive reasoning, or inference to the best explanation. But the point is there has to be an explanation. It's not quite good enough to go dredging things out of the data. Taking things out of the data might inform, what we thought we know. It might start generating new ideas, but some of it can't just be coming out of data. It's got to be some socioeconomic theory, at least meeting it halfway. It will consider processes and interactions. It's almost certainly going to use commercial data like Strava, but it's got to be open and reproducible, surely, if it's science. And there must be some sort of awkwardness between that side and that side of the bullet point, which probably needs to be addressed. So those are some thoughts and ideas, reflecting on our speakers this morning. You know, I don't know what we call this, Jim, but it's not a thumbs up. It could be rude for all now. Well, I'm getting old and increasingly naive, but I think it's okay. You know, I think that, you know, pretty good. I think you're going some way to addressing those thoughts and ideas, and kudos to you for doing so. I very much enjoyed your presentations this morning. Let me end where we started the session. They're not paying me. Hopefully they're going to pay my expenses though, but they're not paying me. To do a plug for the Urban Big Data Centre and for their data services, and indeed for their training and other opportunities they provide. And perhaps just sort of, I could just invite you to join the challenge of using their data and making them usable in the kind of context of social science.